contemporary society says that marriage is simply a deal. You know, you look for someone who will offer you what you need or what you want, who desires what you can give them in return, and then you get married. What that means, though, is that if at some point what you need or want the other person can no longer provide, then the deal is off. But you see, my friends, contemporary society is wrong.
Welcome to the God-Centered Life with Josh Moody Weekend Edition. We're in Ruth chapter 3. The series is called Girl Power, and this is part 2 of our study. Josh Moody is senior pastor of College Church in Wheaton, Illinois, and I'm your host, Todd Bastide. Glad you're joining us today. Thanks for letting us be part of your day. Josh, our opener says that marriage is often viewed as a deal, and there's a good bit of dealing in this story, and a sandal or two that almost changes owners. But it sounds like you're going to go away from negotiation and more towards covenant.
It's one of the, that's a great way to put it. It's one of these myths out there that I find so common when I talk to people about their marriage, whether premarital counseling or sometimes when they're in some kind of challenge to their marriage, that in the back of their minds, they're thinking of their marriage as a kind of deal. You know, I'll give you this as long as I get that, and if I'm not getting what I bargained for, then the deal is off. But that's not marriage. Marriage is a covenant. It's a commitment. Until death us do part, in sickness and in health, for better, for worse. And that must be at the bedrock of all things. And we begin to see this play out, not only in that commitment to one another, but the ultimate commitment that reflects of Christ to us that then allows us to make those kind of covenant relationships with one another.
It's Ruth chapter 3. This is part 2. We'll do a quick review and jump into our new material for today. Here's Josh.
Now, when it comes to the pattern that humans have to make habits, nowhere, I think, is this more true than when it comes to the subject of this chapter, which, of course, is sexuality. Patterns of behavior entrench themselves in our minds, and they influence not just ourselves in this regard, but the whole of society. For sexual behavior is inevitably reproductive behavior, not just literally in terms of children, but whether we have children as a society, whether we take care of our children. All this influences not just you and me, but the whole of our society. And that said, it does not take a rocket scientist to realize that the West is in trouble sexually. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said that if you happen to visit a society on a different planet where people would pay money to see a plate of food slowly revealed to rhythmic music, you would conclude that society had a problem with food. And similarly, we have a problem with sexuality. There's no denying it. It may encourage you then to know that Ruth chapter 3, with all its beautiful romance and its idyllic narrative, is actually written against a backdrop of far worse sexual decay than we experience even today. And what it is telling us, you see, is it's written against this backdrop of the judges. It tells us at the beginning of the book, this was written in the time of the judges with all its chaos. What it's telling us is that the answer to our sexual revolution today is a marriage revolution. This beautiful story. So in this wonderful story, we have at the beginning as God redeems sex with a marriage revolution, the sexual revolution with a marriage revolution. We have first the matchmaker. Second, we have, as the story continues from verse 5 onwards, we have the damsel in distress. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that all women are sort of archetypally damsels in distress or anything like that. As I think I've mentioned before, I actually come from a rather long line of particularly strong women. My great-grandmother would stand on her soapbox at Speaker's Corner in London, a place that's still used for public debate, and she would stand there defending Christian virtue, publicly. And when she was once asked why, despite her strong views, she did not support the suffragette movement of the time, that is, women having the vote. She was said to have replied, "Any woman who cannot get her husband to vote her way is not much of a woman." Now, I'm not saying that is good either. Don't get that wrong. You can be a manipulative damsel in distress. And that is not what Ruth is doing. She's just playing, and I think this is how every successful marriage does it in one way or another. You cannot script it, but it is predictable. She's just playing her Eve for her Adam in a Genesis chapter 2 way, not a Genesis chapter 3 fashion. She is offering herself to be redeemed. And Boaz, as the gentle, godly, strong man who now, as the New Testament puts it, is finding out what it means to love a woman and treat her in an understandable way, is completely trustable with this vulnerability that Ruth presents to him. And so they take up their roles of Eve and Adam in a Genesis chapter 2, not Genesis 3 way, as God by this means draws out of the background of Judges this diamond of a marriage revolution that is the answer to the sexual revolution. There's also here, I think, a little bit of a glimmer of hope for a woman in a Christian context or a Christian culture, a strong Christian culture, who has a man who is showing her interest, but this man seems unwilling or doesn't want or isn't able or some reason or other is not taking the next step in the dating relationship or pop the question or define the relationship, as the Christians at Yale used to call it, DTR, conversation, they would say. And I think this tells us that it's not always wrong in a Christian context for a woman to bring things to a head and say, well, now look, where do we stand? Now, sometimes, of course, having said that, that conversation can catch a man off guard. And if you decide to do that, you have to be aware of that. I remember one poor girl coming up to me when I was an undergraduate student and saying she felt that we needed to define the relationship. And I was frankly so caught off guard, all I could think of saying was, what relationship? You know. And so if you are a young college student, and that happens to you, or a young man, single man, I trust you'll be more tender having had this sort of context explained to you. And if you're a college student, a young woman, or a dating woman, you will need wisdom as to when to bring things to a head. But if the Bible does not say that though it was extremely unusual, not a model to emulate or copy, though it was extremely unusual, it does not come out and say that Ruth was wrong to take this kind of initiative to push this particular millennial over the edge into actual commitment. Then I don't think it's wrong for a Christian woman to define the relationship and have that kind of conversation as appropriate at the right time. But for that to work, though, you'll need not only a matchmaker, not only a damsel in distress, but also third, the knight in shining armor. Or as the Bible describes it with more theological rigor, the Redeemer, verse 10. Now here's Boaz, this godly man is standing, but who came so much more after Ruth and their marriage together, who before Ruth came along was only half the man he would become. You might say he was ruthless. But now he has the opportunity to redeem her. And so, of course, not only fulfill a legal function as a levirate marriage according to the customs of Deuteronomy, but also fulfill the role of redeemer in that relationship for her, for the family, the course of salvation history as his lineage goes to David, to the Messiah. Now, it seems to me, my friends, that Boaz responds in three very significant ways as a redeemer archetypal figure here. One, he is committed. He has to check to see whether there is the other Redeemer who's closer in relationship will act upon that possibility. But he says, if not, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. So now, having been pushed to the point of decision, he makes a commitment. He's not allergic to commitment, but understands that this is a part of growing up, that there is a stage of life where there are many possibilities and you take in all the options, but part of growing up or getting to a next stage of life, even if you are already grown up, is committing to a particular course of life. And if you say to yourself, well, I just don't do commitment, then consider what would have happened to Boaz if he had turned his back on this opportunity for commitment. But no, he took courage in both hands and plunged in. And so he took this decision. And you see, often the course of your life is decided not by whether what you decide is perfect, but by whether you perfectly decide. That is, whether you are truly committed. And whether in marriage or in ministry or in friendship or with God, don't give in to a sort of commit-a-phobia. Dive in, move ahead as a pastor or missionary. Take the potential that has been offered to you this morning as we gather around God's Word and commit. Boaz was committed.
We'll pick up a few more key traits of our knight in shining armor in just a moment. But first, wanted to take a second to let you know that we're glad you're joining us. If you're joining us for the first time, this is a program called God-Centered Life with Josh Moody. He's the senior pastor of College Church in Wheaton, Illinois, and he's passionate about gospel-centered teaching. And if you'd like to find out more after the program, feel free to swing by our website, godcenteredlife.org. Right now, though, back to Ruth chapter 3. Here's Josh.
2, Boaz understood covenant. He understood covenant. Now, I can tell you with a degree of certainty that the source of many a marriage difficulty is an initial misunderstanding of covenants that has to be rewired and reconsidered. And you can see that Boaz understood covenant when he says in verse 10, you have made this last kindness or chesed greater than the first. And Boaz is referring specifically to the covenant word of mercy, love, and kindness, chesed. And this covenant, this chesed, is a thread that runs throughout the book of Ruth. It's Naomi's hope that her daughters-in-law will experience chesed in chapter 1. It's Naomi's joy that God's chesed is being experienced by her and Ruth as Boaz takes care of Ruth in his field in chapter 2. And now Boaz sees what Ruth is doing, affirms her chesed commitment to Naomi already, and thanks her for her chesed commitment to Boaz now. See, Boaz understands that what they're about to embark into is a marriage relationship, which is a chesed, a covenant, and not just a deal. Basically, you see, contemporary society says that marriage is simply a deal. You know, you look for someone who will offer you what you need or what you want or whatever it is, and who desires what you can give them in return, and then you get married. What that means, though, is that if at some point what you need or want the other person can no longer provide, then the deal is off. But you see, my friends, contemporary society is wrong. Marriage is not a deal, it is a covenant, chesed. Marriage is modeled after the covenant commitment of God to his people, as that is why this word here is used in this relationship and in God's covenant love for the people as well in this book. In the same way, then, that God is unwaveringly, unshakably, unchangeably committed by covenant to his people, whom he has redeemed, so we in marriage are to be similarly, unwaveringly, unshakably, unchangeably committed by covenant. It's the same chesed word, by covenant to each other. And you say, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that when she is old and can no longer perform as you would like, you stay. That means that when in his middle age he loses his job and can no longer provide as you would like, you stay. That means that when he is disabled through a car accident, you stay. That means that when your children are disabled, you stay. That means that when you argue, you find a way to forgive. It means that you have a chesed covenant. You are one. In fact, in British law, what a man says to his wife or vice versa is impermissible as evidence, for the law considers that what you say to your spouse is the same as talking to yourself. Now, for the repentant, there is redemption too. And of course, this is ultimately about Christ's love for the church. But I wish to underline for you the covenant commitment that is necessary for a marriage revolution to redeem the sexual revolution that Boaz understood. Well, Boaz gets that commitment, he gets that covenant, but Boaz also gets contentment. See, what does he do? He tells Ruth to not go back to her mother-in-law empty-handed, but gives her 6 scoops of barley to take home. We don't know exactly why 6, we don't know exactly how large the measures were, but what we do know is that Boaz is deliberately, by this symbol, by this action, he is deliberately reversing the feeling that Naomi had when she first came back to Bethlehem. Perhaps you remember that Naomi had publicly said that she had gone away full, but come back empty. Her offspring of the womb had failed. She felt then as empty as only a woman whose husband and 2 sons had died could feel empty. But now Boaz, you see, understanding his role of redeemer for Ruth, but also Naomi, the family, the mother-in-law, tells Ruth to take back this symbol of their coming fullness. He uses then exactly the same word that Naomi used in chapter 1. He is saying, then you are no longer empty. Be content. Now you see, we are told, aren't we, so often these days that more is always better. But actually, more is endless. Until we can say enough, we can never be happy. Desiring more will not make you happy unless you can be happy with what you desire. There's one professional basketball player who was interviewed by ESPN towards the end of his life. At one point in his life, had claimed to have slept with 23 different women in 10 days. He said towards the end of his life this, and I quote, "With all of you men out there who think that having 1,000 different ladies is pretty cool, I've learned in my life, I've found out that having one woman 1,000 different times is much more satisfying." Or perhaps if you prefer ancient wisdom, Epicurus said, "Do not spoil what you have by desiring what you have not. Remember that what you now have was once among the things you only hoped for." So you see here the knight in shining armor is rescuing the damsel in distress, the prodding of the matchmaker, for he understands commitment, covenant, and contentment. I told Rochelle that I was going to relay this story to you all this morning, but I remember when Rochelle and I first went out on a date. It had been some time coming, at least from my point of view. I'd been trying to persuade her for about 6 months, and it felt a good deal longer. And the nadir, the bottom, the pits in this attempted courtship came when I called her on the phone and I asked her out on a date, and she explained that she could not because I have to fix my bicycle that evening. And I thought I'd heard everything until then, but every possible excuse. But a good friend of hers said to her afterwards, "You know, Josh would feel better if you said no after you'd at least given him a chance." And so on a date we went, and the rest is history, or rather 4 children, a decade and a half of ministry, 2 churches, many, many joys and heartbreaks, excitements and disappointments, but life that is committed, covenant, and content in all of its right sense of that word. So as we think of this story and this passage, I wonder then who it is that you need to give a chance. Is there a godly man or woman or good friend who you are shy of committing yourself to? I wonder if there's someone you need to give a second chance. You know, I've only ever met one perfect person, and I meet him when I pray to him. Everyone else is just a forgiven person. Remember what Jesus said about not forgiving. Oh yeah, it may well have been his or her faults, but that does not mean that you are not at fault too, at least before heaven. But of course, most of all, I wonder whether you need to give God a chance this morning. This romance, this matchmaker, damsel in distress, this knight in shining armor, it's only really about marriage in as far as marriage is really about the Redeemer and the people he redeems. And perhaps then it's time that, as it were, you put on some anointed oil. You got washed. You lay at the feet of your Redeemer. Who knows, that may be the best commitment you ever made.
That's Josh Moody, and this is The God-Centered Life. Well, yes, the book is called Ruth, and it's Ruth who gets the knight in shining armor. But Josh, could we not say that it's Naomi who gets the bigger rescue? I mean, she was rather bottomed out earlier in this story.
She is a somewhat forgotten character in the book, isn't she? And yet she is very much a part of the story and a significant part of the story. And by the end of the book, symbolically, the child is even put in her lap. So the promise and the faith that she had in that promise is fulfilled in this story as well. And so you may be a Ruth, but you may also be a Naomi. And the gospel here is for these different generations. Boaz is a part of it as well. And it's all intended to reflect the true message of Christ as the rescuer for Naomi and Ruth and Boaz and us all.
Thank you for that, Josh. What an amazing story of God's providence. What's your story? Are you celebrating it as we're new into this year? Are you aware of how God is directing you? How God is redeeming you? How God is taking the sideways motion that we get ourselves caught up in and making it work for the kingdom? Certainly hope so. We hope this study is helping you understand that God works through adverse circumstances. Next time we get together, we're going to be looking at celebrity Christians.
There are the celebrity Christians, and then there's the rest of us. Wrong. The way I read the Bible, I am as much made in the image of God as you and as anyone else.
We'll continue our study in the book of Ruth when we get together next time. One more reminder, GodCenteredLife.org. Resources for you, your opportunity to partner with us. And this is your invitation to join us next time we get together right here on the God-Centered Life with Josh Moody Weekend Edition.